Hello, welcome back to another Allure book review series. It's your girl, Nimue and Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Mrs Ayn Cates Sullivan, an award-winning and best-selling author of several books. Without further ado, let's welcome her to this conversation. Hello, Mrs. Sullivan. Thank you so much for joining me here today.
I'm delighted to be here with you. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, before we talk about Nimue, I would like to ask why you chose to focus on Celtic mythology.
I'm an old Celt, so the stories in my family, my grandparents used to tell me stories of, I live in the United States, but I was told stories of our Scottish ancestry and Welsh ancestry and so forth. And I was lucky enough to get an overseas research award to go to King's College London when I was in my, I think I was in my early 20s. And I went over and all of a sudden this world opened up. So I call it my dreaming country. I think all of us, if we follow our roots and our heritage, we all have our dreaming country. I know the sort of Aborigines talk about it and other people. And so what happened when I went over was that I suddenly realized that there is this magical kingdom. There's this magical world, and it exists, and it kind of blew me away. I think the first time I really got it, I was in Ireland, and that became Legends of the Grail series. That was the beginning, because I was like, oh my gosh, they're these really powerful feminine characters, and I had never really heard about any. I mean, I knew about Greek goddesses and Roman goddesses, and some of them were interesting, but here in the Celtic world, also the truth of Vikings, they're very strong, empowered female characters. So that's what got me going.
That's quite interesting. Thanks for sharing. Could you please tell us about the main character in your book, Nimue, freeing Merlin?
Yeah, so I have it here. Here's Nimue freeing Merlin. And I had an encounter, I was doing a meditation when I was in Cornwall many years ago. I was at a place called St. Nectan's Glen, and you can go visit it. I had gone down to see Tintagel and the castle where King Arthur was meant to have been born and where Igraine had lived, and I had gone down to the ocean and stood as the waves crashed against Merlin's cave. So I was in that world. And when I went to St. Nectan's Glen, I got into the waterfall there. There's a very special waterfall, and I actually literally felt the presence of Nimue. So when I write, what I do is I go to the landscape where these characters are meant to have lived and resided. So now I'm in the world of Nimue where she was meant to have been kept. Now it's mythological, but these stories live in the landscape. So I had a very strong feeling of her, and I basically just fell in love with her. Now, when I went back to write the stories, I realized there were two different types of Nimues. There's one, and there's been movie series written about her, where she's a sorceress. She's a demon. And in some of the tales, she's beheaded. And then in other tales, the earlier tales, before the feminine was demonized, they're tales of her as Merlin's lover and as a magical woman. So when I wrote the book, what I was trying to do was bring all of those threads together to go that here's Nimue, she's magical, she has many sides to her being, like all of us. We have many sides to our being, right? So here it is. It's a magical female character who's powerful, and who the stories are really about it's sort of a redemption story, really.
Wow, I love the fact that you actually get to visit the places where these characters lived and get to experience or feel their presence. It's actually nice. Still on Nimue, I would like to ask, what aspects of her character did you find most compelling to explore?
Well, Nimue is a complex character. The story starts out with woman Nina, and when I started writing the book, there's an autobiographical piece because my father had also just died, and I was dealing with it, and I did get back to England to sort out what was going on, and I did do a past life memory, so there's an autobiographical part to it. But I think what's compelling both with Nimue and also with Morgan and Merlin for that matter, is that they're, in the Druid tradition. So I went and really worked with the Druids, studied with the Druids, and started to understand that these are indigenous people. I mean, the Druids are basically the indigenous leaders of the ancient Celtic world, and there's a neo-Druid revival going on. But when you go and when you're in the living landscape and you work with these deities, you start to realize that they were in touch. It's absolutely beautiful if you can feel it. They're in touch with the wind, the sky, the sea. They're in touch with all of the elements. And when we allow ourselves to open, because we don't just have 5 senses, we have 12 senses. When we start to open to these many senses, what happens is we start to develop superpowers. In India, they would call them siddhas. We start to develop siddhas. So the people of the Celtic world, the magical people of the Celtic world understood that, still understand that. And so I think what's the most compelling about Nimue is that she's willing to face all the shadows in order to stand truly in her power. And I think if there's a character right now that is a heroine for me, that it's Nimue, because we live in a world that's pretty crazy right now. When she lived in a time when the Roman Empire had collapsed and there was chaos in the land, and Arthur had appeared and was attempting to bring unity back to the tribes. And so she is, I believe, a mentor in a way that we can look up to, that if we really trust our own innate powers, if we trust our own guidance, we can walk through anything.
Wow, that's quite fascinating. Moving on, what do you hope readers will feel or experience as they read through Nimue? And were there any particular message or themes that you wanted to convey through the story?
My intention behind the book, one intention, it was actually kind of interesting. I was with some Mayan priests in Los Angeles who said to me, and this was real, I was at a party, and they came up to me and they said, the stories of the women of your people, you should write those stories down because people need them. And at first I didn't quite get it. Here they are, they're like really quite small, but their eyes are really bright, and these are dreaming people. They understand the dream world. And my husband, who's Irish, says to me, listen to what they're saying. They're giving you a message. And my daughter came over too. And so now we're all talking with these Mayan elders. And this conversation happened about 2012, right during the shift of the ages. And so I said, you're right. I do know the stories of the women of my people, of my tribe. And it's very important that these stories are told again. And so I'll do it. And so I feel like I'm fulfilling a destiny piece and telling the tales.
Well, that's really great and interesting. I've read a couple of your books aside from Nimue, and I must commend your writing prowess. And there's no telling the amount of work and research you put in. So I'm curious to know what your creative process is like.
I'll say this. I grew up in my mom's art studio. She's an international painter, and my dad was also a writer. So I grew up in a very creative household, and so we were always really encouraged to listen to our dreams, to stand on the landscape and tune in. And so that's really what I do generally, is I go to a place. If I'm curious about a story, I'll actually literally go to the place, and then I'll just let my imagination go. And so I've done a series of cards too called Imaginosophy, and so I call it Imagine Sophia. Imagine that you're in the wisdom field, and what is it that field wishes to share with you, and then I just run with it. One thing that I do that's really important for my creative process, I've written 23 books now. What I do is when I stand there, or if I can't go someplace for some reason, Like, sort of during the pandemic, I couldn't go. I'll just travel in my imagination to the place. And when I'm there, I just allow the download to happen. So it's not, people say, are you channeling? I'm like, I don't know, but it feels like an attunement. I'm attuning to a story and I just write it down. What I make sure I do not do is I don't edit while I'm writing. I don't allow any critical voice in, or any voice that says you shouldn't write this, or cut this out. So it's just the creative flow. Once the whole book is done and the whole story is done, then I go back and edit. And I spend a lot of time editing and making sure that the facts are correct. And I'm in I'm doing mythological, historical mythology, which is sort of a conundrum. It's a paradox, but I try to stay true, in this case, to the Welsh mythologies.
That sounds like a very rich and rewarding journey. And I would like to ask, how do you balance staying true to the original mythology while also infusing your own creativity into your work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the reasons, and I think this is why the Mayan priests were chatting to me, is that it was really monks that wrote down the stories. After with the coming of Christianity, a lot of monks or priests wrote the stories down, and a lot of the tales. If we're going into the tales of the Lady Sovereignty, or the May Queen, or some of the more ancient deities, because the Celtic goddesses go back 10,000 years. If you go back to I've written about this, like the Kalia, the old woman of the world, is in the first book, Legends of the Grail, and or Bridget, or some of the more ancient deities, and some of them are called chthonic deities, and they're earth goddesses, so they have a darker nature to them. But what I think is important about retelling the stories is that, or remembering the stories, redreaming the stories, is that it was something John Matthews, who's England's expert on King Arthur and one of my mentors, said to me, was that if the stories aren't retold for each age, they die. Because each age is going to see them with a different lens. And the way that the monks might have seen these stories, or different writers might have seen, they probably were men, and they would have seen them in a particular way, definitely through a Christian lens, which is fine, but some of the female deities were demonized. And of course, some would go through the years of witch burning and so forth, where these stories in some cases were twisted to make these goddesses evil. And so that was part of the work that I was going back through, was to go, are they evil? Are these women evil? Or has the story itself been twisted? And so what I found in pretty much every case is that it was the story that was twisted, not the deity. So one of the main examples is Blodeuwedd, is a Welsh deity in the heroines of Avalon and other tales, who was the wife of Lugh and was considered the adulteress. So what I did in that story, and the reason I retold that story, is that I didn't want to see this flower goddess lost in the forest as an owl chanting "who" for the rest of her life. I wanted to release her back to her flower goddess status. Make sense?
Yeah, really intriguing.
So that was a little daring, a little probably feminist, but it's definitely a daring move. But I do believe that the feminine voice is back on the planet. That the women are more empowered now, that we have our voice again, that we can speak, that it's important for us to speak. Because this is another thing I'm going to say about women that I think is really important right now, as there are wars raging everywhere, as people are divided, the race relations are terrible, and religious wars and all of the stuff that's going on. Women don't do this. Goddesses don't do that. Goddesses unify. Goddesses love life. Goddesses love people, and they don't care what color their skin is. They don't care what their gender is. They don't care. There's a place for everyone. And I think and you know, freeing up the goddess, you're saying, let's unify, let's come to a round table, let's all love each other, because we need to create a culture of life. And that's really what the goddesses did. They held life sacred for all beings, for all human and non-human, all sentient beings. And that's why I love them.
That was quite insightful. Thank you so much. I would love to ask if there's anything you would love to add or discuss with us.
Yeah, there's one thing you can go check out. If you're really interested in like the intuitive roundtable, I love all these different deities. So I have a website called imaginosophy.com. You can go and check it out, and all the deities are on there, and you could read about them. You can work with them. You can work with me if you want to. There's a contact link. You can get in touch with me if you want to do that sort of intuitive work. And then the next book that I have that's coming out is called Riddles of the Ancestors, and Nimue's in it and Morgan's in it, so the two main characters, and Nimue freeing Merlin's in it. But Ganaida comes forward as one of the main protagonists, and she's Merlin's twin sister. She is from the stars. She is very magical. She's very light. She's absolutely lovely, and she comes because she realizes that humanity needs to be rescued, and that there's a shift of the ages going on, and so that she has to go back and find the codes from Atlantis and bring them back to the surface again, so that humanity can carry forward. So it's really fun. It's, you know, it's totally sci-fi fantasy, but it's fun, and it's hope for humanity. Let's put it that way.
All right, I'll definitely be looking out for Riddles of the Ancestors, and I already checked out imaginosophy.com, and oh my god, I absolutely loved it. So guys, do well to check out imaginosophy.com. The link is going to be in the description box. Also, the link to your own copy of Nimue is also in the description box. Do well to check it out. Thank you once again, Mrs. Sullivan, for joining me here today.
Thank you so much for having me.